All right. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Chuck D'Antonio. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering here at Replicated, and welcome to our first in a series of Replicated deep dive sessions. Today's session is focused on choosing existing versus embedded cluster with your customers, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Amber.
Amber Olson, the VP of Product at Replicated.
Hey, I'm Alex Parker. I am a staff product manager here at Replicated.
And our goal for today's session is really to facilitate a conversation. So a conversation that sort of goes deep into this topic rather than a presentation from any one of us in particular from Replicated. I would say the three of us probably all have some strong opinions around this topic, and we will certainly share those, but we would love to engage each of you as well in the conversation. And again, just a quick reminder that we are recording. So, sort of implicit in joining in the conversation is that, we will be sharing the conversation in the future. And I just wanted to make sure everybody's clear on that before we get started. So to get started around this question, and sort of, how do we choose, I guess, would be the question, with our customers, whether to use to deploy to an existing cluster or to deploy with the embedded cluster. I just want to ask, and we can do maybe a virtual show of hands using the Zoom features for that. Who's engaging with this question right now? Being asked by customers or deciding within your team which approach makes the most sense. I'll of course raise my hand because I engage with folks like you every day in these types of conversations, and I would bet that my colleagues would too. Cool. All right. Not seeing any of those little Zoom hands go up, but that's okay. So I would say that, sort of taking that information as it is, I would say that this question will, definitely come up, whether it's a question that you address within your team in terms of should we prefer one of these approaches over the other, or it's a question that comes up with individual customers about how they will deploy. And I think sometimes I have found that this question is clouded by some misconceptions. And I'd like to ask Alex, as the product manager for Embedded Cluster, if there's a top misconception or two that he encounters in having these discussions.
Sure. So I think that when I'm talking to people and they're trying to decide whether they should encourage their customers to deploy to an existing Kubernetes cluster that they have either in their own data center or like a cloud provided cluster or something like that versus using embedded cluster. One of the top things that I hear from people is an assumption or a belief that embedded cluster isn't as real of a cluster as an EKS cluster that you get from Amazon or a GKE cluster from Google or something like that. A lot of people can see the value of using embedded cluster for POCs, and it's a very easy way to trial their software and spin it up quickly without needing to go through a bunch of processes or things to provision that infrastructure in their cloud themselves. They can just get a VM and everything's going to get deployed there automatically. But there is sometimes a perception from people that embedded cluster isn't going to be as reliable, isn't going to be as sufficient of a cluster as getting that from a cloud provider or some other Kubernetes provider. Do you want me to speak to that as well, Chuck, as sort of
Yeah,
how
I
we do
was,
that? And
yeah. Do you have thoughts about where that might come from, or why you consider it a misconception?
I think so. As far as where it comes from, I think maybe it's just the fact that it's our unique solution, and people might not, they're not necessarily as familiar with it, right? So if you get an EKS cluster, there's obviously probably millions of those floating around in the world that lots of different organizations are using, and people might be more familiar with Rancher or some other Kubernetes providers. So some of it might just be a familiarity thing and wondering how this thing is built and does it is it capable of handling the workloads and sort of the stress that these other distributions have and whatnot.
replicated embedded cluster is not something we built from scratch. And it does have a track record outside of what we've done, and we chose that because of some of this concern that people might have had. Is that a fair recap, or you want to add a little more to that?
Yeah, exactly. So just to recap that, yeah, we build embedded cluster on K0s, which is an existing distribution that I think the last I heard has like 7,500 daily active clusters running out there. So it's not our own thing that we built. It's building on top of an existing thing and bringing like a product solution, product experience around that.
Excellent. Okay. Apparently there's two of me here now too. Okay. So to sort of keep the conversation going, I wonder if there's anyone here, and this includes Amber and Alex as well, who might want to share um, whether there's some questions that are most revealing around kind of which way a customer might want to go. So let's presume that this decision about embedded versus existing is going to be based on customer circumstances first. We'll talk a little bit more later about how it might be something that the software vendor chooses on their own as a direction to go. But if it's driven by the customer, anyone here, including you, Amber, if you might have some ideas about revealing questions about the
One of
customer
the most
environment.
important questions to start with is to really dig in on whether, if you're considering installing into the customer's existing Kubernetes cluster infrastructure, is if your application is going to be installed on a truly dedicated cluster where you are the only resource running on that cluster, or if you're going to be installed into a larger cluster that has many possible workloads on it. I know we want to talk a little bit as we continue this conversation around some of the various challenges those different scenarios represent, but by far going into a shared cluster creates the most challenges in the existing cluster scenario. So that's always the first thing you need to understand. Is this going to be a dedicated cluster for you or not, if you're considering that path?
I think it's a really great point. And the other one I like to think about is sort of, what are the controls on the cluster you're going into? And is your application ready for those controls? And there can be challenges, especially say if we're moving from a SaaS where we control the cluster and we control the application, et cetera, and then we're starting to do deployments where we haven't thought through things like security contexts and network policies that might be required by that cluster we're going into. So that can be a challenge that
Right,
I've
because
seen.
even, oh, sorry, Jack, but
Yeah,
even with dedicated clusters, say you're like, okay, great, my end customer is saying they're going to give me a cluster that's fully dedicated to my application. Even in that, to sort of like jump on Chuck's point there, you really need to understand what the enterprise IT constraints are around how they manage those clusters that can end up impacting your application. So whether that is required Kate's image and security policies like Caverno, Gatekeeper, et cetera, but also we see a lot of enterprise customers that the only way they deploy into production is controlled CI/CD pipelines. And so is your application ready to be deployed in that way? There's a lot of things with even with a dedicated cluster for your applications that you still have to comply with how the enterprise security team insists and requires that they manage those clusters.
yep. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is, and this was sort of lay dormant in my mind for a little bit after a couple of years ago, hearing one of our vendors was asked that all of their images build off the customer's base image. Now that's a really sensible policy for first-party applications, but it maybe hasn't been considered as to what the impact of that policy is for third-party applications. And I just originally when I heard that, I thought, well, that's just, it's a little silly. And it's clearly a sign that the policies are built around first-party applications. But I've thought through that a little bit more and realized that it may be that the team that's responsible for the clusters and the platform around them hasn't really considered third-party applications. Um, and does it make sense for any? I mean, there's going to eventually, I guess, have to be a first one. But I'm not sure that I want to be the first one as a software vendor to sort of try to sort of go down that path. And that could be an interesting question to ask when trying to when a customer wants to deploy to their existing Kubernetes infrastructure. Is are there already third-party applications there? Alex, is there I think kind of from your perspective with embedded cluster, have you seen scenarios where maybe people have come back to embedded cluster because of some of these types of hurdles or policies, or do you think people are just sort of starting there and moving forward with it to sort of avoid it in the first place?
Yeah, I definitely think there's both, but I certainly have seen some people who have gone down an existing cluster path and ended up sort of falling back to embedded cluster and seeing, I think like a couple of the benefits with embedded cluster are that, Amber was talking about a dedicated versus shared cluster. Obviously, with embedded cluster, it's inherently dedicated because you're deploying the cluster and the infrastructure as part of the application. So, if you have CRDs that you need to install or any sort of cluster scoped type of thing that needs to be done, with embedded cluster, you necessarily know that you have the permissions and the ability to do that because you really manage that cluster in its entirety. I think another similar example is additional infrastructure outside of the cluster itself. So, embedded cluster has support for something called extensions, where sort of outside of your application, as part of the cluster, you can deploy Helm charts, and that could be something like Cert Manager or an ingress controller, any number of different things that you might need your customer to set up if it was an existing cluster. It's not a part of your application. It's going to be dependent upon the infrastructure that they've set up. But in an existing cluster, you might need them to deploy that. You need them to install the right CRDs or set up a load balancer or any number of different things. So while existing cluster obviously can be a great choice and is very useful for enterprises that are more opinionated and have sort of the right processes and tools in place to get all of that set up, from a vendor standpoint, it can often be easier to lean into embedded cluster because of the control that it gives you over that whole environment, the cluster, the infrastructure, your application, et cetera. So I think that's one instance of where I've seen people fall back to it, is when they had some challenges getting additional things deployed or getting the right permissions in the cluster. If their customer was willing to just give them a VM, that simplified that process a lot.
Sure. And Amber, from your perspective, have you seen any evolution around the types of challenges with either style of install and the considerations that might evolve the decision-making process?
Do you mean evolution more just like over time, or more like
Yeah,
as someone is considering going through this process, working with the in customer?
sure. Over time,
Yeah.
yeah, sort of in the market
Well,
changes.
yeah, I mean, in general, just the extreme emphasis around securing these platforms, right? Everything from ensuring the images that are being installed, like have image attestations, hard to say,
Mhm.
and other types of things, to being much more stringent with policies around what can deploy, what can have cluster admin type privileges, et cetera. So seeing a lot more of, like, when you are trying to go into an enterprise customer versus, say, Alex is talking about that dedicated embedded cluster for you, we're seeing a lot more like minimal RBAC style requirements, and that can cause a lot of cascading impacts on like what your application expects to be able to do in the cluster. More like, pod to pod communication restrictions, requirements for external secret stores, all sorts of things have become much more standard, and we see a lot more customers running into issues with those than we have in the past. So definitely the extreme focus on security over the last few years has continued to push considerations that vendors have to consider if they want to sell into this market. Um,
I would agree, and I think, we've been working, I know, around our compatibility matrix in trying to look at the types of things that might go on in representative clusters with customers, and even something as simple as some of the defaults. If a large enterprise is deploying OpenShift, some of the default expectations, for lack of a better word, or assumptions in an OpenShift environment are these types of policy style constraints, right? Security context being set, things not being root. Um, there's I still don't fully understand some of the weird stuff it does with security contexts when you don't provide one, to be frank. And
Yeah, OpenShift in particular, we see a lot of folks. I mean, they're basically packaging their own form of Kubernetes and locking it down with a lot of security constraints. So that's one of the reasons with our compatibility matrix product, we one of our most popular testing distributions is OpenShift because we want to help you catch those things before you actually release it. But we're also seeing some, again, and just as more and more folks get even more security conscious on these existing clusters, we're seeing things like more enterprises expecting you to provide an allow list of like what firewall ports they need to open, etc. Right? And we've seen issues where just even trying to provide that list. Then if you do provide that list, if you end up through the ongoing iterations of your application accidentally violating that list, not only do you have install failures because the firewall rules block you, but you break your customer's trust. So these are just all things that we're at Replicated trying to help focus on helping you not just think about, but also test before you release your application as well.
cool. I'm wondering if maybe some of the again, opening to the whole floor here, if maybe there are some other factors that folks have seen. I have a couple in my mind, but I'm wondering if anyone else might want to share before I share a couple of my own here. Um, well, one thing I wanted to pick up on is the sort of sense of evolution, Amber, and you were talking about how securities evolve, but I also think that platform teams, the cloud native space moves fast, and what platform teams are using today um, can evolve fairly quickly, and it could be in terms of installation methods. I feel like conversations I was having a year and a half, 2 years ago, Argo, 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 and now Flux, 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 Flux. Hey, GitOps is still fundamentally the thing, which is great. And deploying Helm charts with GitOps approaches is something that I certainly feel pretty good about. But the shift from Argo to Flux is something that teams have had to be aware of if they're shipping to customers who are going to be deploying from their Helm chart. So into an existing cluster, it's sort of like, well, what does Flux do differently than Argo in that scenario? And especially in the Argo scenario, as I understand it, Argo doesn't really do a Helm install, whereas Flux does do a Helm install, and that can be, sort of challenging if there's some exception, some expectations in how your chart was constructed and the Helm idioms that it uses. Even those tend to evolve, the idioms that are expected within a Helm chart. Or maybe I just learned to understand them more. I'm not sure which, but they seem to have evolved. I'm curious, Alex, as I share some of these, um, are these the types of things that you're thinking of day to day around uh, the ease of embedded cluster?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the goal that we're always striving for with embedded cluster is to be able to abstract away a lot of the complexity and the challenges and the technical stuff that is necessary to get your application set up in these customer environments. So whether that's being able to give you full access to that cluster so you can deploy the needed infrastructure, things like that, but also abstracting some of that complexity away for your customers. So people who are not necessarily as familiar with Kubernetes and not as comfortable provisioning that and maintaining that and whatnot, being able to bundle all of that together and just make it seem like I'm just installing an application and there's going to be infrastructure and different components that come along with that, but that's not a detail that that user needs to be thinking about necessarily. They can be thinking about, I'm installing and upgrading this application because that's what I bought, and I don't have to think about all the other pieces. And so I think that is a way to be able to make self-hosted software and distributing, as a software vendor, distributing your software into customer managed environments much easier. If you can take away all of the operational burdens and challenges that your customers are going to face by installing that, and just make it feel like I'm just installing this application and it just works, that's going to make the process to of moving to self-hosted, either away from SaaS or whatever it is, moving to self-hosted is going to be much easier if you can take those away. And so that's certainly a big goal that we have in how we're building embedded cluster and new features that we add to it and things like that.
Sounds like that's also really valuable for the software vendor themselves, and this might lead to them making a decision of, hey, we ship with the replicated embedded cluster. Like the cluster almost becomes an implementation detail on their side rather than a infrastructure detail for their customer.
Yeah, certainly. And I think I think at Replicated, we don't want to be prescriptive about how people ought to do it. So, it's not like we are saying embedded cluster is 100% the thing that you should use out the gate. And you could fall back to other options if necessary. I think every business has different customers who are in different situations and have different levels of expertise and knowledge in different areas. And so every situation is going to be unique. But I do think that for a software vendor, a solution like embedded cluster can be really appealing as a default or as a go-to option because of the control that it gives you and because of the simplicity both for you and for your customers.
And I think that probably cascades throughout the vendor organization, right? Um, their support team um, has, their documentation, their customer, the folks in the various customer success roles. Um, the embedded cluster sort of gives them a common baseline to communicate about in all those types of conversations. So um, it's not saying that they don't need folks in those teams that are familiar with the types of things customers might be doing in the existing cluster scenarios, but if they sort of embrace embedded cluster as, you know, I'm going to say a preferred method, for lack of a better way to put it, um, those teams end up with sort of a single path to trod rather than multiple paths to trod.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could cascade all the way through, you know, what into sort of customer operations things too. If customer, what does disaster recovery look like for the customer's cluster is a very open-ended question if you go into a customer's cluster. But if you're deploying with embedded cluster, disaster recovery has a very specific mechanism, right? Where do backups go? How do you configure them? How do you restore? All of those steps. It's less to think of, and may even, I don't know. Do you think that also cascades into their QA efforts because they're able to uh, constrain what they're testing?
Yeah, certainly. I think like to what you're saying actually reminds me of another uh, thought or objection that some vendors sometimes think of when they're evaluating embedded cluster, and that's with embedded cluster, I, as a software vendor, am taking on responsibility for a lot more than if I just deploy into an existing cluster. With embedded cluster, I have to take on the responsibility of the cluster and the ingress and all the additional infrastructure. Wouldn't it be easier if I could say that's my customer's responsibility? All I'm responsible for is my application that's going to get deployed into that cluster, and it's on them to set up those prerequisites and maintain them. But at the end of the day, if you have a customer that is not well equipped to set that stuff up and they make a mistake or something fails or goes wrong, it's not like you can wash your hands of that and say, well, that's your cluster, so you got to figure that out. Like if your application's down in a customer environment, you're obviously going to take that very seriously and want to work with them to help them to get that resolved. And it's not going to be sufficient in the customer's mind to say, oh yeah, I guess that's my problem. I'll just deal with it. They're going to want you to help because they want to get that application back up and running or whatever the problem might be. So whereas sometimes people can look at this and say, I'm assuming more responsibility for more pieces, that doesn't seem like a win for me. I think the reality is often that yes, you're assuming a level of responsibility for those pieces, but it's a known quantity. It is a cluster that you're familiar with, that you are controlling how it's installed, that you're controlling how it's upgraded, that you're controlling the additional pieces that get deployed onto that cluster, and things that can conflict. So it might sound appealing to say, I'm going to let my customer get a load balancer and deal with that. What if the load balancer is not working? What if, they set it up and configure it incorrectly, or any number of things? So there's certainly a trade-off between the responsibility that's assumed in each place. But I think at the end of the day, as a software vendor, you're going to assume responsibility for the whole thing in order to help your customers have a smooth experience with your product. And by doing that in a way that you control it and have access over it, as opposed to hoping that your customer does it in the way that you've documented or encouraged them to do it, can actually be a very big benefit for you. And
I,
Yeah,
I'm
we've
so
seen.
oh, go ahead, Amber, please.
I was going to say we've seen issues where, to Alex's point, you're never really offloading that responsibility because we've seen issues with some of our customers, unexpected policies or updates get applied to the cluster and it ends up breaking the application. You weren't anticipating that, but it's not enough to just be like, well, the cluster's their responsibility layer, right? Your product is not working for your customers. You're going to get involved in that scenario. And the other thing that we've seen, having worked with just hundreds of vendors and thousands of end customer installations, is also the fact that some, staffing changes over time. Like they might have had more Kubernetes expertise when they first agreed existing cluster was the best path, not so much later. We also see even like the types of clusters and the policies you're dealing with when you consider this path changing over time as well. We talked about evolution a little bit before, and that is something that we see too, right? Like that the shape and the policies of these clusters, the staffing support at your end customers, these all change over time. And we've seen a lot of that, right? Whether it's due to like risk tolerances changing, incident remediation requirements, new technical leadership. Like a year from now, you might not actually be installing into the exact same cluster environment you were when you first made that decision. And so you end up having to take on a lot more of that responsibility. So it's a little bit of a red herring to think that you can completely offload the infrastructure responsibility by just installing into the existing cluster a customer has, especially if it's a shared cluster. And to Alex's point, like when you have that embedded cluster, you are fully in control. You decide when those cluster updates get applied, when you decide when the next version of Kubernetes is supported on that cluster and gets upgraded. So that's all within your control, your ability to test before rolling out those deployments.
So go ahead, Alex, please.
I was just going to then tie that back to sort of the original question that you had asked about, might some of these embedded cluster benefits cascade through the rest of your organization? And I think that the obvious answer there is certainly yes, that with documentation, you can document how each customer on AWS and Azure and GCP and Oracle and whatnot are going to provision a load balancer and set that up and make sure it's working right. Or you can encapsulate all of that in your embedded cluster install command. So the customer is just running install and that's taking care of it. So I think docs can be simplified, the support process as well. Again, largely to the same point I just said, but you're supporting something that you're familiar with. It's what you're testing on. It's what you're building and using. It's not X load balancer or X ingress controller or whatever it might be that the customer chose to use. It's exactly the version and the specifics that you put into your release and chose to use. So I certainly agree that that's going to cascade into other parts of the organization too.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's funny. I have probably never considered this before, um, but it's almost some of the same. If you think of folks who have shied away in the past from doing customer managed installations, they've shied away for some of those same reasons to be able to make more assumptions, to have more understanding of what the various procedures are, et cetera. And the embedded cluster is now bringing that same sort of set of benefits that people have seen perhaps in preferring SaaS. It's bringing that same set of benefits into the world of the customer management requirement.
Yeah.
I had never considered that before this moment, but I hear it a lot in what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. So let's think a little bit about what a conversation might look like. I think first of all, should there be a conversation? Do we think that as a software vendor, I should be going out to my customers and saying, I need Kubernetes. I can install into your cluster, or I can bring one along? Or do we think we should be short circuiting that with this is the way we do it, and then sort of falling back to something else?
Where we've seen the most success with our customers is when they guide that decision. They're like, this is our way to do it. Certainly you're going to run into some enterprise customers that have very strong opinions, but those should sort of be fallback secondary conversations around what might we. We've by far seen the most success when vendors are like, this is my documented and supported install method. This is how you do it. Um, Kind of back to the varying skill sets of Kubernetes. I mean, despite the fact that Kubernetes has been out for a while, enterprises have a lot of mixed skill sets, and those are constantly changing with all the change in the technology industry the last few years. And so we have found that our vendors will often, if they give them the choice, they'll often run into, oh, yeah, well, we have some Kubernetes clusters here. Like, let's just go into that. That seems like an easier path. But they're not actually set up for success there. When our vendors come starting with this is the right way to install, you give us a VM, we actually take care of the cluster and the application lifecycle for you. That you don't see nearly the pushback that you would expect, and so that's where we've seen more success with our customers.
Yeah, I think to sort of pick up on that a little bit, I have, I think you can, even a customer who's saying something like, "Oh, we've got some Kubernetes over here. Let's use that." I think you can ask some questions about that that maybe guides them toward an embedded cluster choice, or at least guides you as the software vendor into knowing whether it's safe for you to go into those clusters. I think things like sort of knowing who's responsible for it, understanding how the two teams relate. I think a lot of times what we've seen is that the buying team isn't the platform team that runs Kubernetes, and they're worried about getting slowed down going into that. But even if teams are close and tight and work well together, um, some of these questions about third party versus first party applications being running in those clusters, just how easy is it to get cluster capacity, whether it's a dedicated cluster or the namespaces that you need to install in, versus getting virtual machine capacity, as well as what is usually done for commercial software, right? If there's a ton of Kubernetes in the organization, but commercial software is usually done on virtual machines, that sort of guides down the road of doing a virtual machine-based install, and that seems to be what embedded cluster brings.
Yeah.
So, when I think about it, like these are the types of questions I might ask, right? Do you already deploy is Kubernetes in your organization? So I think we all think that's a good question, because I think if the answer is no, you probably don't want to be going into an existing cluster that that your customer brings along as their first one. I think we could all agree on that one. If the answer is no to, do you have a Kubernetes infrastructure? Are you deploying applications to Kubernetes? Then I think that's a clear embedded cluster qualification. Um, who's responsible for it? How do you deploy to it? Are you already running third-party applications into it? These are some of my core questions. I don't know, Alex and Amber, or really anyone here, if you've got some additional questions you might want to ask if someone's leaning toward using their infrastructure.
Yeah, and we have faced some kind of questions where customers already have their existing environments up and running. They have all the security requirements met in their existing cluster. So when they try to apply those same security policies on an embedded cluster, they could face a lot of challenges. And when they start having those problems, then they can ask about why they can't use their existing cluster to avoid those issues, because those existing clusters already have their security policies. And they
It's a
have,
really good point.
yeah, but however, the answer for that question is that we won't have control over that cluster. We don't know the Kubernetes version or the other tools versions that they are using, and some of them can lead to unknown issues. and that could have conflicts with the things that Cox or our application will need. So that's why most of the time we prefer having an embedded cluster, because that will avoid a lot of headaches.
Yeah. I think, Alex, what Christian said about wanting to apply governance to the embedded cluster, is this something we see coming up across a lot of customers? It's something that comes up rarely. And how would you approach that conversation?
It definitely comes up. I don't know that it's coming up, all the time by any means, but it certainly does come up in a number of instances. And I think with where we stand today, that often can be a good reason to use an existing cluster. If someone has a very strong stance on Kubernetes itself and where the images are coming from, and how I can attest to their look at signatures and make sure the images are what I really think, and use my own registry and make sure the cluster has these requirements in it and things like that. Those can certainly be signs that going with an existing cluster will be a good option for that customer. At the same time, I certainly think that there are parts of that we want to roll into embedded cluster to be able to accommodate that. For example, using your own registry and being able to push all of the images into your registry, but still do an embedded cluster install, or things like this. Like, there's definitely ways that we can continue to improve embedded cluster to help ease that friction of getting into customer environments and making sure that it's within their policies and things like that. But I do think that often when there's that level of specificity in the requirements around the cluster and how it should be run and things like that, that often can be a sign that the friction of getting embedded cluster to work might actually end up exceeding, in some cases, the friction of getting the existing cluster to work. And that can be a good metric for which direction you want to go in. Is that how you feel, Chuck?
I do, and I think it's a good leverage point for, if you're working with an organization that's thoughtful about their governance, and sometimes that's a big if, that potentially there's room to sort of bridge. Hey, you've got, network policies across namespaces in your existing, as required. For example, every net's, network, you've got network policy enforcement necessary in your clusters. This is a single application running in a single namespace. What is that governing? Right? This cluster only runs this one application. What are you trying to govern there? So I think there's some room for conversation around the types of policy enforcement and governance that they might want, and whether it makes sense in the context of this dedicated cluster managed by the vendor, essentially. I mean, indirectly, I guess, managed by the vendor through the way it upgrades and things like that. Whether those policies apply, but I think you're right that if if engaging in a creative and in-depth conversation around governance is challenging, which it is in a lot of organizations, that it's a good sign to go towards an existing cluster.
Yeah.
We're coming up on our timeline, our end of our scheduled time together. I'm curious, sort of as we look forward, what would you say, Alex? I've been all along saying you're the embedded cluster product manager here at Replicated, but really you're the product manager around all things installation related, as install being sort of one of the phases of the commercial software distribution lifecycle. So that puts you I think, in a pretty unique place to be thinking about, what Replicated's doing moving forward around this question. What are some things looking forward that are kind of guiding principles for you around, sort of embedded and existing clusters? And what might we see in embedded cluster that comes from that?
Yeah, so let's see. I think one of the guiding, I've already mentioned this, but one of the guiding principles for embedded clusters specifically is abstracting away some of the technical complexity and, giving the vendor more control over what's deployed and making it easier for enterprises, regardless of their setup or their technical expertise or things like that, to be able to install it. So I think in that realm, things that continue to make the experience easier for the end user. With embedded cluster, we've leaned heavily into what we're calling click ops, where major workflows should be done through the UI and things like that. So continuing to lean into that and making sure that the way of doing things with embedded cluster, getting it installed, getting it upgraded, troubleshooting issues, monitoring and preemptively being able to see the disk is filling up or the cert needs to be rotated or things like that are all the sorts of things that we want to continue to improve upon with embedded cluster to make sure that it continues to be easy to use and is easier for vendors to get all the right stuff deployed into their clusters. And so I think that's certainly one of the most important guiding principles for embedded cluster. I think with existing cluster, we're also seeing a lot of people, we've obviously talked here about preferences that people have and organizational policies and things like that, and how that can dictate how accessible an existing cluster is or how you deploy into it and things like that. So I think for us, continuing to listen to those signals and see how are enterprises deploying into existing clusters, what's the tooling that they're comfortable with and that they're using. So, if you've followed Replicated for some time, we've been continually leaning into Helm, as we've seen Helm be a very standard tooling for deploying applications into Kubernetes clusters. So continuing to have our Helm install option be a great way of delivering an application into an existing cluster that fits with a lot of organizational policies. A lot of enterprises, both for first and third party software, are accustomed to deploying a Helm chart. And so giving them a Helm chart that they can then do with as they see fit, whether that's plugging into a GitOps pipeline or deploying it themselves or whatever it is, can help ease that friction of getting things installed and fitting into that existing cluster. So I think those are a couple of the things that come to mind off the bat.
Right. Thank you. And Amber, you look across our entire product line and our entire platform. Could you distill to sort of one thing that you hope everyone will take away from this conversation today? Oh, I think you've not come off mute, Amber.
Yeah, I have not. Classic Zoom problem.
Yes, indeed.
That's a great question. I think just really thinking through probably a couple things, really thinking through that entire commercial software distribution lifecycle and how the decision you're making impacts that, right? Because it's not just the install process. That's just, step one of getting your application in their hands. Even past all the sales and proof of concept and all that, you have to continue to maintain, support, upgrade, troubleshoot this application that is running in customer managed infrastructure. You need to understand how many instances they have. Are they violating their license entitlements? All of these things that you need to install. And so thinking through, like leveraging some of the resources we've put out there in the public around what are all of those different aspects of software distribution life cycle that I really need to continue, and thinking through what is this embedded cluster decision versus existing cluster decision like mean for me and my application in each of these phases. And that'll really help, I think guide you to making the best decision for you.
Great. All right. Thank you. And I think I'm going to answer my own question too, because why not?
As you should.
Sure. I think, my big takeaway, or what I would hope people would take away, is that this is a production grade cluster. If I think of the questions I've had, I've around, is this something that just demos well with my team, but they shouldn't think of using, or is it something that's just going to demo well for them with their customers, but their customers won't want to go into production with? I've heard too many of those questions. I've heard people start from the perspective of, oh yeah, this is just going to be for POCs because we don't want to operationalize on it, and then go to operationalize on it because they saw how great all those other factors were that you were talking about, Amber. This is a production grade cluster. Customers are running it in all sorts of environments, highly secure environments, everyday environments. And it's a great way to, sort of, a very advantageous way for you to deploy your software. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for our first deep dive. I hope we've been able to illuminate you a little bit on one of these choices that folks end up having to make around how to distribute their software. I apologize for the technical difficulties that I'm sure you've forgotten in the context of all this great content we've had today. And I hope you'll join us for the next deep dive session.